This was a night for parties in power. In Wales, Labour hold good. In Scotland, the SNP stays strong. And in England, the Tories make some remarkable new gains. So is the electorate broadly happy with the status quo? Hartlepool was the day's headline.
Prime Minister, is it another brick out of the red wall?
As Keir Starmer admits to a bitterly disappointing night. The Greens make gains. We'll track each party's direction and tell you why it matters.
Here in Edinburgh, the count that could decide the fate of the UK continues into the weekend. Is the Scottish Parliament heading for a battle with Boris Johnson over a second independence referendum?
Hello, good evening. The narrative of a mid-parliament election's normally one of a drubbing for whoever's in office. Not this time. The Conservatives have been rewarded in England for a hugely successful vaccine rollout and the economic furlough support of the last year. Scotland, where counting hasn't finished, sees the SNP on course for a fourth successive victory, despite an embattled year for their leader. And Labour are having perhaps their best night in the nation they govern, Wales. In the north of England by-election, Labour saw Hartlepool slip into Conservative hands, a stupendous swing of 16% towards the party that's been in power for 11 years. The result looked rather modest compared to the one that followed, a 73% share of the vote to the Conservative Tees Valley mayor. Keir Starmer has seen all this and not even tried to pretend it was fine. He looked shattered and shell-shocked by the Labour performance. And so to the big questions. What is Labour's offer to the electorate now, and why hasn't it been heard? Are the Conservatives fundamentally a different party which depends on big spending to stay popular? And critically, could the whole United Kingdom be undone by whatever ends up happening north of the border? We start with our political editor, Nick Watt, who began the day in Hartlepool but ended in London, where we're starting to hear rumblings about the mayoral race here, Nick.
That's right, Emily. So the London mayoral race is looking much, much closer than expected. So we've had half of the results in. So we've had 7 of the 14 super constituencies in London. And it's looking like Sean Bailey, the Conservative candidate, much, much stronger performance. Now, what London Labour sources are saying is, look, we never believed the polls, which show that Sadiq Khan was way ahead. We never believed them. It was always going to be close. They say it was always going to be a two-horse race. We're not going to get that result definitively until later tomorrow night, possibly even into Sunday morning. Now, even if the Conservatives don't win in London, that result is going to tell us a very big picture about this performance today. And what that shows is that Boris Johnson is doing better today than he did in the 2019 general election when he got an 80-seat majority. Hartlepool by-election, the vote is up. The Tees Valley mayor, dramatic increase in the vote, and there are high hopes in the West Midlands that Andy Street, the incumbent Tory mayor in the West Midlands, that he's going to do even better and he is going to win, they hope, on the first round. Now, what does this say about Boris Johnson? It shows that he has enormous and greater authority in England, but potentially still question marked over his grip over the future of the United Kingdom, because as you were saying, Emily, the SNP doing well, Nicola Sturgeon going to be confirmed again as First Minister, but question marks about whether she's going to get an SNP majority, and that might make it more difficult for her to have the moral authority she was looking for to say to Boris Johnson, we must have a second referendum. Boris Johnson on that tonight, interview in the Daily Telegraph, front page tomorrow, saying no to a second referendum. But you know, the real final lesson about the Conservative Party in all of this is what has been the secret of the Conservative Party's success over 150 years. It's to reinvent themselves. 10 years ago, austerity, we've got to balance the books. Now, as one former cabinet minister put it to me, Boris Johnson just loves spending, but he doesn't want to tax you for it.
And what is Keir Starmer thinking this evening?
Well, Keir Starmer is under enormous pressure, and under enormous pressure from both wings of his party, the sort of disappointed supporters and the agitating left. So what are the left saying? They're saying it would be foolish to have a leadership challenge, not least because they don't have, they believe, a credible candidate. But they're saying, look, you, Keir Starmer, look at what Joe Biden has done. Joe Biden has united the left and the so-called New Democrats. How's he done that? He's Uncle Joe, so you could be Uncle Keir. But he's had a policy programme that's quite left-wing. How are you going to do that? bring back Jeremy Corbyn, bring back John McDonnell, put them on a policy board and allow them to sort of draw up policy. The natural Keir Starmer supporters, they are very disappointed. They want a clearer exposition of policies. And I've been talking to one member of the Shadow Cabinet and they say, delighted, brilliant vaccine rollout, but they're really concerned that from their point of view, this means that this is going to be Boris Johnson's Falklands moment. He's going to win the next election better than the 2019 one. That will be the end of Keir Starmer. The left will take over the party again, and this member of the Shadow Cabinet said to me that would be the end of the Labour Party. So Hartlepool has in a sense been the defining result of the day. As you were saying, I spent most of the day there. Here's how it went. A timeless quality, come rain or shine, a Labour citadel. All changed now after the Conservatives, once reviled in the northeast of England, captured a jewel in the Labour crown. And a victory lap for Boris Johnson.
Prime Minister, is it another brick out of the red wall?
Nick, we're just going to go over here. We've got to go talk to Beth. Here in Hartlepool, clearly people were... this is a place that voted for Brexit, and we got Brexit done, and then we're able to do other things, thanks to that.
A very happy Boris Johnson in Hartlepool Marina, a town that not so long ago the Conservatives never dreamt of capturing. But this win here shows that Boris Johnson's general election victory was no one-off fluke. Something deep is happening here in the northeast and across other parts of England, as normally tribally loyal Labour supporters spurn that party and turn to the Tories.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
A walkabout, a look-alike, and then a collapse. Not, of course, on the political front. Jill Mortimer captured the town with a 23-point increase in the Tory vote after the disappearance of the Brexit Party, way exceeding expectations, and a 9-point fall in the Labour vote showed it has lost ground since the general election. No excuses from Sir Keir Starmer.
We have changed as a party, but we haven't set out a strong enough case to the country. Very often we've been talking to ourselves instead of to the country, and we've lost the trust of working people, particularly in places like Hartlepool. I intend to do whatever is necessary to fix that.
Back in Hartlepool, it was not difficult to detect the mood for change.
Well, I'm well pleased that they've gone. They've had it for too long and they just expected to take it every time. Just time for a change. Everyone's lost faith in them, so hopefully we'll do a bit better.
I think it's work. I think people needed jobs, and Boris came up with it.
Yeah.
He got them jobs, and they appreciated that.
Obviously, it's early days, but if he can be successful, like the jobs at Darlington for the start, the Treasury moving there, that's a great thing.
It just looks like something's getting done, and we're getting recognised because we were just, everything stopped at Manchester and Leeds, and then didn't come any further up.
When Keir Starmer came here to Hartlepool, which really annoyed me very, very much, he was eating fish and chips and drinking pints. If he thinks that we eat fish and chips, drink pints with cloth caps on, he's got the wrong people.
Amongst lifelong Labour supporters, resignation.
Are you sad that the Conservatives have taken this seat?
Well, not sad.
Particularly bothered, really.
Disappointed.
Disappointed.
A local commentator says deep reasons lie behind the collapse in Labour support.
There has been a historic drift away from Labour for a couple of decades now. People looking for an alternative as the old industries become forgotten about, so forgotten about that they just become nostalgia, like the ship behind us. And people have been looking for an alternative for Labour. Here in Hartlepool, they voted for a man in a monkey suit because they couldn't quite bring themselves to vote Conservative. But then with the push of Brexit and the appeal of Boris and indeed Ben Houchen in the Tees Valley has shown them that Conservatives are not as bad as their grandparents might have thought.
Changing times in a changing town, symbols of a new political world.
Nick Walk with that report. Now to discuss the ramifications of this, we're joined by Guy Opperman, the Work and Pensions Minister and the Conservative MP for Hexham in Northumberland. Guy Opperman, have you been surprised by the scale of what you've seen today in Tees Valley, in Doncaster and Dudley and Hartlepool?
I think there is a real change that is happening in the country and a change in perception of the people in how they view the Conservative Party and a real disappointment in the Labour Party as they now perceive them. And you see that. I spent the last month campaigning in Northumberland, County Durham, but I did several days in Hartlepool, including election day. And on election day, we kept meeting people who were coming out to vote, who were voting Conservative for the first time, or sometimes the second time, who genuinely believed that there needed to be change after 57 years of a Labour MP and not much to show for it. But also they really wanted some of what Ben Houchen had shown was capable of happening in Tees Valley. And you see in Ben's result where he got a 73% outcome. And in circumstances where he has really delivered for the local people. You know, he's bringing the free port with the 18,000 potential new jobs there. Yeah. He saved the airport. There's real change coming, and Hartlepool people wanted that.
It's interesting to hear that word change, isn't it, from the party that has been consistently in power since 2010. Let's talk about that financial distribution agenda then, because part of that was the Towns Fund. And when it came out of the 45 areas, 40 of those had Conservative MPs. So is the message that if you want money to go to your town, you have to vote Conservative?
Well, no, I think that you're talking about things like moving jobs to Darlington, which was mentioned in your clip. You know, the Treasury jobs, the 750 jobs that are going to Darlington. That was discussed repeatedly under Labour, but it never happened, even though they had Tony Blair as the Prime Minister. The idea that Redcar would be sat there and nothing would be done about it after the Labour Party were in charge when it closed. What we're doing is we're regenerating one of the largest industrial sites in the entirety of Europe. We're doing it through the Freeport and various other things. And that, I think, is investment in a region that has been forgotten by successive generations, as Ben would say.
So let's talk about that investment, because this has been an exceptional year. Everyone recognises it. An extraordinary vaccine rollout. Now the opening up of the country, you've paid the wages of 11 million people a year. Now, if I said to you, you are now the party of big spending, you have changed, if you like, the algorithm. You're the party of big spending, you're the party of investment. Is that how you see the Conservatives going ahead now?
No, I see we are the party of delivery and of building back better, fundamentally. What we're also doing is we're navigating a terrible pandemic, and we're doing whatever it takes, as we have done so, to ensure that we get through this pandemic. Then we're going to dust ourselves down and we're going to build back better. That's what we're trying to do.
But are you going to sustain that?
In different ways.
I mean, you'll know how nervous David Cameron, George Osborne were by big debt, by big borrowing. Do you feel part of a different Conservative party? I mean, is that going to end, or are you going to carry on that spending? Not on the furlough, not on the pandemic, clearly, but at the same rate that you think is needed now?
Well, I feel part of a different Conservative party because we're having massive success in the North East. When I started, there was one Conservative MP in Hexham. We're now up to 11 with Jill's election. I feel part of a different Conservative party because we're delivering on the people's priorities, and we're navigating the pandemic, and we're doing it successfully in the way that we're now beginning to build back better. That is surely what this is all about. Well, and I believe, don't ask me, ask the people of Hartlepool or Tees Valley, because they have absolutely vindicated the views of the PM and of Ben Houchen, and they've backed us in 73% and 23% swings to Jill.
And when the Conservatives get more dominant in England, there is, I guess, an irony that you may be giving more power to the SNP as a result. I mean, if you gain England and lose the UK as a result of this, if Scotland can turn and say, look, you know, we don't want to be part of Conservative Westminster, Conservative UK, and you lose the union, will that have been a price worth paying?
Well, listen, my constituency of Hexham borders at Carter Bar and beyond the Scottish border. I was campaigning in the Scottish elections only last Saturday. Clearly, the results are not in, and we'll wait and see what happens. But I believe very strongly in the union. I believe in this United Kingdom, and I believe that there is a great desire to maintain that, and that's shared from the Prime Minister downwards.
Guy, thank you very much. We're joined now by the Shadow Business and Consumer Affairs Minister, Lucy Powell. Lucy Powell, everyone from Keir Starmer to John McDonnell to Peter Mandelson has said Labour has to do better. And they've used various platitudes to say that, but no one has spelled it out. Can you spell it out for us here?
Well, quite clearly we have to do better, because there's no sugaring the pill of the results today. And whilst they're sort of devastating in some ways, they aren't a surprise, because, as your report said just before, the red wall has been crumbling for 20 years. There are long-term issues that we have, that we've broken the trust with voters around the country. They don't believe what we've got to say anymore, and they don't believe that we're offering the change that the country needs. And I thought it was very interesting that in your piece there, I've made the same observation myself, that people of Hartlepool and elsewhere are voting for change. Right. And in voting for change, they're not voting for the Labour Party. Yeah, but I think they're voting for the Conservative Party.
But you've all made these observations, and yet it took a Conservative minister just now to point to things very directly. That you talk about Darlington and moving the Treasury, a Labour idea apparently, from the Blair years, but it never happened. The Freeports idea or liberalising the airports, again, talked about, never happened. I mean, isn't that the point, that Labour is navel-gazing and the Conservatives just cut through it and get on with it?
Well, we have been talking to ourselves too much, and that's why we haven't been talking to the issues that people care about, wanting decent jobs close to where they live, secure homes, world-class education. They want us to be at the forefront of the green industrial revolution, and we've not been talking about those issues as much as we should, because we have been, to some degree, navel-gazing. And I think, what I would also say is that even in our time in government, we did rely too much on the sort of trickle-down economics, if you like, that if we created growth, eventually it would reach all parts of the country. But people of Hartlepool will tell you that they didn't feel it ever reached them, and many other parts of the country will feel the same. And that's why what Keir's agenda is about, what he's starting to shape out on, what I think he's going to now accelerate very much so, is that we do need a new reckoning on the economy. Right. We need an economy that works for all parts of the country, for all people, that addresses some of these deep inequalities that have been so exposed during this pandemic.
And maybe the way to address them, we heard a lady in the piece saying, when Keir Starmer comes here and he drinks beer and he eats fish and chips, it feels quite patronising. It's like you're trying to fight a Labour battle or the image of what Hartlepool is like, and you're fighting a battle from the 1980s. It just, you're scared to be the modern party there and take forward new ideas.
Well, we have to take forward new ideas.
But I'm asking you very simply, why hasn't that happened? I mean, what you've lost, I know Peter Mandelson's been through the number of elections you've lost, but why does it need spelling out to you at this point?
Well, to be fair to Peter Mandelson, lots of this decline actually began under New Labour as well. It's 20 years in the making: deindustrialisation, alienation, disconnection. And, in more recent years, we've been too inward looking and talking to ourselves and not addressing the big issues that people care about. And no one is under any illusion, Keir Starmer least of all, of the scale of that challenge. And if it was easy, and by the way, we're also facing, as you've just heard, a Conservative Party that has parked their tanks all over our lawn. They are splurging money and spending money in a way that they traditionally wouldn't do.
But they will say it's not your lawn anymore. That's the point. They've just worked out that land was up for grabs because people had lost trust. Let me just ask you about the route.
Let's just see, though, because, I think some of that is very superficial. And will they really do what it takes when it comes to intervening, for example, in our steel industry? Will they do what it takes when it comes to equipping our car manufacturing with the electric future that it needs? Because they're not taking those steps so far. So they talk the talk, but let's see if they will walk the walk eventually.
Let me ask you about a colleague's remarks. Khalid Mahmood talked about a London-based bourgeoisie and woke social media warriors. Do you recognise Labour as too progressive, or do you I mean, I guess, you know, the point Nick raised was that in America, Joe Biden has managed to be, you know, the party of racial reckoning and of old-time blue-collar workers, or however you want to see the industrial heartlands. Why is Labour having a problem uniting those two ends of the horseshoe?
Well, if it was easy and if there was a simple solution to it from our past, either our recent past or our further back past, then we'd be doing it. It isn't easy. This is a big issue and a big challenge for Labour, and it will take a united Labour Party, all wings of the Labour Party, coming together and putting our best minds together and our best united front together to really address these challenges. And we can definitely take inspiration from Joe Biden and what he's doing in America in doing that. There is a coalition there that we can build that is a winning one once again. It involves mobilising our base as well as reaching out those former voters.
OK. Sorry to cut you off, we're out of time, but thank you. Sometimes you can end the night knowing the headlines, but little understand those ripples beneath. Well, Lewis Goodall's been looking at the direction of travel for the parties and what it might mean. He's at our wall. Lewis.
Yes, Emily. Well, let's look at Hartlepool first, shall we? Because, of course, it was the first result that we had. It set the tone for the day. It was a body blow for Keir Starmer. As we've been hearing, Tories piling on vote after vote after vote, reaching up to, well, 52% there, almost entirely absorbing the Brexit Party vote that we had at the 2019 general election, 25.8%. You can see it there, easily enough to take them over the line. Labour's vote was drawn upon slightly for the Tories as well. And that represented, we had to make it appear sooner or later, didn't we? That represented an enormous 16% swing for the Conservatives. Truly extraordinary. It wasn't just won modestly for the Tories, it was a stonking victory. And of course, that sends a shiver down the spine of endless Labour politicians in that this might not be a one-off. Take a look at these seats. These seats here, all with very significant Brexit Party votes at the 2019 general election. Doncaster North, Ed Miliband, or South Shields, or Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, Yvette Cooper's constituency. Usually, these places, they have the Labour majorities in these places are actually smaller than the Brexit Party votes in these places. So these are obvious opportunities for the Conservatives to potentially expand the electoral map yet further. But if it were just Hartlepool, Labour could potentially just ride this out, say it's easy to overinterpret by excited journalists by-election results, but they can't do that because of the council results which came with them. Take a look at this, and we could have chosen many indeed. This is the situation in Harlow in Essex. That hadn't been Tory since 2012. It was Labour until last night. 7 straight losses from the Labour Party, 7 straight victories for the Conservatives. Dudley, very, very similar story. 11 losses for the Labour Party, 12 Conservative gains. Before last night, in Dudley, it was almost nip and tuck, about 24 seats apiece. Now the Tories have 46 seats to Labour's 24. And the same picture in Nuneaton and Bedworth in the Midlands. Classic marginal Nuneaton, of course. 10 seats fought by the Labour Party, 10 seats lost, 10 Conservative gains. And this was repeated again and again and again, almost as often as we saw the same pattern as in Hartlepool. UKIP votes in 2016, when these seats were last contested, absorbed by the Tories and overcoming even solid Labour majorities. The coalescence of the right, whilst the left parties remain splintered. And talking of splintering, it wasn't just the Tories where Labour lost out, but the Greens, if you actually look beneath the surface today, put in a very decent performance in council after council. For example, here in Sheffield. Here, Labour lost seats to the Greens, and they lost seats to the Lib Dems as well, opening up the possibility of splintering on the right and on the left, potentially in the cities, which of course now are Labour's bedrocks. And now, then you had to the mayoral result in the Tees Valley, won by a minuscule margin back in 2017 by Tory Ben Houch, and today he scored nearly 75% of the vote, an astonishing personal mandate and political transformation in Teesside of an area which was once as Labour as it could get. But as ever in modern British politics, it's a bit different over the border. If Labour had had a bright spot today, it was in Wales, in government for 20 years, but it looks like they're having a good election there, mostly holding on in the clutch of seats in the northeast of Wales, many of which they lost in the general election in 2019. Seats like Delyn. Let's have a little bit closer look at Delyn, shall we? Yes, this is a very different pattern that we saw in England. Yes, the UKIP vote collapsed, as we saw in many places in England, but look, it didn't just go to the Conservatives. It also benefited the Labour Party as well. Some to the Tories, some to Labour. Completely different. If this pattern had been replicated in England, then Keir Starmer would have had a much bigger smile on his face today. Plaid had hoped to make gains, not just here but elsewhere, but so far, a pretty disappointing day for Plaid. All in all, though, outside Wales, there was one word that summed up Labour reaction today. It was fear. Fear that 2019 wasn't the floor, that it wasn't a full stop, but a comma in a process of realignment and decay for the party. Keir Starmer, remember, was the man who was supposed to stop that bleeding, and the fear tonight is that it's become a hemorrhage.
Lewis, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's pick up there with Caroline Flint, former Labour MP for Don Valley, Sir Nicholas Soames, the former Conservative MP for Mid-Sussex, and Jonathan Bartley, the co-leader of the Green Party. Caroline Flint, can I just ask you about that? Because you were a casualty of 2019. Did you expect that to be the floor? Or do you consider this to be more bleeding? Or do you think that they are picking up, but not in any substantial way?
We lost in 2019. I lost in 2019 because the voters in my constituency and many other so-called red wall seats, particularly I'm talking about where predominantly have white working class communities, almost a working class, middle class, I would say. They own their own homes, but culturally they define as working class. In towns outside of our cities and university towns, very, very different communities, they felt they weren't being listened to. And in 2017, I think we should step back to that. Labour didn't win that election. We lost that election. And in many seats like mine, because our communities and voters were suspicious of Jeremy Corbyn, they weren't signed up to the sort of politics around him. My majority went down then, and so did many others. In 2019, when you roll forward, the big difference was that in 2017, we promised to respect the outcome of the Brexit referendum. And by 2019, we both had Corbyn and we had a pro-people's vote. That was one flank too many. But underlying all this, and it's come up in your early reports, is a disconnect, I have to say, between the middle class, more metropolitan side of our party, very much based in our cities, with London dominating, in fact, a couple of square miles in London, of North London very often, with our more working class voters. And they are the bedrock. And those, if you like, sort of white working class voters have been the foundation of the Labour Party.
Okay.
And they're not from Hartlepool, they're from all the way down to Hastings. And so this is something that came to a fore in the referendum, and it hasn't ended.
Right.
And I warned about it before 2019. I'm afraid what I was saying and warning about is still coming true.
Right. Let me pick up with Sir Nicholas Soames, because we focus very much on the Labour Party and what it's doing wrong. Would you accept that the Conservative Party is fundamentally different now? You told me a couple of years ago that you didn't recognise the Tory Party anymore. Do you recognise this Tory Party?
Well, I do. You know, it's changed beyond anything. The party I joined in 1983 when Lady Thatcher was in her second term, and it changed because it had to change, and then it changed, and in my time changed profoundly because of Brexit. And those quarrels are now mercifully behind us. The country voted to leave, and they've now got on with it. And I think that what Boris Johnson has achieved is quite exceptional here. And I think this victory of the Prime Minister's and the Conservative government will confer very considerable authority and prestige on the government and will enable them to now move forward. And the principal problem with the Labour Party, if I can just say this, is that Caroline Flint, who is an incredibly hard-working, good Labour Member of Parliament and a wonderful colleague, you know, lost her seat because of people's loathing for the Corbynites. And the thing is that the Conservatives want to be in power. They want to make a difference. They want to govern. Labour is far more interested in its own navel-gazing, its ideological rise. And I remember Dennis Skinner once telling me he'd much rather not be in government and continue to hold the flag.
But, Sir Nicholas, you also know what it's like to be in the middle of what feels like a civil war. You yourself had the whip removed. Many others who thought like you were kicked out of the party at that point. I wonder if you reflect on that now and think that the reflex that Boris Johnson and his advisers had then was the right one, that they had to be merciless.
Well, look, I think the Prime Minister was perfectly entitled to remove the whip from me because I refused, with 21 others, to vote for his prime policy. All those days have now gone. That's all behind us now. And the Prime Minister, in my view, and this government have really achieved something remarkable in this country. I think for Ben Houchen, the mayor, the Teesside mayor, to get 75% of the vote in the heart of the Labour heartland is nothing short of a miracle. And we have seen something really extraordinary tonight, from which a very powerful platform will be built, which will propel the Conservative Party forward for a very long time.
Let me bring in Jonathan Bartley. You've made gains in Sheffield, Northumberland, Suffolk. We saw some of them there. Easier to be a one-party issue at this point. You don't face the problems that Labour has, which is sort of finding your core message.
Well, I think the reason we're making the gains, and I'd like to say we took more seats off the Conservatives today than we did off Labour, so we can win where Labour can't. Those people that are voting for us are seeing that we actually are much more than a single issue party. And we're finding that when you get Greens elected, you suddenly realise that Greens have a whole prospectus, actually, that Labour have now ditched. We want to see, yes, tackling the climate emergency. We want to see affordable public transport. We want to see a universal basic income to lift people out of poverty. Let's abolish those food banks, the need for them. Let's have the decent, warm homes that the government has now ditched, getting rid of its Green Homes grant.
And if Labour comes to you and says, actually, we might need some help going forward, we need what feels like a coalition partner, maybe that's too formal a word, could the Greens do that?
Look, what we're seeing today is a product of the two-party system. It's, I can't vote for them because they're pretty bad, but the other guys, they're slightly less bad, so we'll go for them. That's what's behind the Conservative gains. It is this two-party system which needs to be cracked open. And if we have to work
say that's behind the Conservative gains. They've made some extraordinary gains.
Let me ask you what vision the Conservative Party actually has. Both of these parties are basically saying, we want to have power. Now, what is the prospectus that we can offer the electorate in order to give us that power? We're coming from a completely different perspective. Electoral politics for us is the means to an end of tackling the climate emergency, dealing with inequality, making this country a welcoming place for refugees.
Okay,
we have a vision. The other two parties do not have a vision. And
Caroline,
so
what's yours? What is the message, if you had to put that into 5 words?
Reconnect with our base, our working class support. Make sure what you promise you can deliver. You don't overpromise and underdeliver, and speak in a way that actually reflects that you like working class people would be a start. Part of the reason why people are still angry in Hartlepool and elsewhere is because they don't think they're valued and respected, and they don't think that there's been enough apologies for actually how they were treated over Brexit. It's not just about Brexit, it's about other issues. But underlying the whole issue was a patronising contempt for those Labour people who voted leave.
But isn't what you're talking about now, when you're saying reconnect, is what you want them to do for you? You want them to reconnect with you to sort of establish the Labour Party again. No, I mean, what are you giving them?
But you have to start by, if you're saying you're listening, and I heard Lucy Powell, I've heard many others from the Labour side talk about listening, but actually we've spent the last 6 weeks talking about curtains in number 10 and phone calls with James Dyson. It is very clear from the telephone polling and being out on the doorstep, as I have done in this election, as I have done for the last 43 years in the Labour Party, is that was not what people were talking about. And the Labour Party knew that, but they continue to bang on about issues that were within the Westminster bubble, weren't the concerns of people in Hartlepool, Redditch and many other places.
There's definitely something in that listening.
They have to deal with the concerns that people are talking about on the ground. Okay. And understanding
there is something in that listening, if I could just say, definitely. But again, it's listening in order to get political support. Now, in the Green Party, we have a very democratic structure where people on the ground, our members, actually determine our policy. We're talking about citizens' assemblies. We're talking about participatory budgeting, whole communities actually getting together and having real power. Okay. Now, the other parties, they won't democratise. They still want to have that control from the top down and impose their vision.
But sometimes you need leadership. And one of the things that Keir Starmer said was it's not about wallpaper and it's not about soft furnishings. It's about integrity, it's about truth, and it's about answering questions when they're put to you. Now, can I ask you, Nicholas Soames, that the system that used to work was, I think what Peter Hennessy called the chaps code, gentleman's honour. The good chaps area of government. The good chaps. You've called the Conservative Party very different now. I wonder if you think that Boris Johnson cares about that, doesn't care about that, doesn't need to care about it, the sort of the honour-bound rules. Has that gone now? Is that the way to succeed?
No, I don't think it's gone at all. And of course, all that's got to be done properly. And it is true to say amongst your profession and the wider public, controversy is priced into the Boris Johnson share price. I'm afraid that is the case. But quite apart from that, people really like Boris. You know, one of the things that I found really impressive about the Hartlepool election is you got the impression that people in Hartlepool, they love where they come from, actually. They love their country, and someone gave them a voice. And I think Caroline Flint is completely right. It's not for me to tell the Labour Party what to do or to intrude in what must be a very, very difficult time, and we've all been through it. But it requires leadership, vision, and a united party. And the thing about the Conservatives is that even when the going is tough, they do come together because they want to govern and they want to do the right thing. And every now and again it comes off, and it's come off now.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us. More from me a little later, but now over to Newsnight's very own Duracell bunny. That's Kirsty in Edinburgh.
Thank you, Emily. Well, good evening from Edinburgh. 24 hours after polls closed, a nation is still holding its breath. We won't know until tomorrow whether the SNP have reached the magic number of 65, the seats they need to win to get an outright majority in the Scottish Parliament. But there is now no doubt they will be the largest party and form the next government. And it's highly likely there'll be a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament with the Scottish Greens. And that poses a problem for Boris Johnson. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said there will be a referendum by 2023, and tonight she said she's going to go ahead with legislation for a second independence referendum, and Boris Johnson will have to go to the Supreme Court to stop it. Well, we'll come on to the enormous constitutional implications for Scotland and the United Kingdom of this election in a moment. First, here's Lewis Goodall with a breakdown of the results we have so far.
Yes, Kirsty, this may be the most exciting contest of all, but though it is exciting, consider actually how static much of Scottish politics actually is. Look at the constituency map of Scotland. So far, only 3 seats have changed hands. The constituencies have largely, reliably returned SNP MSPs just as they did in 2016. No huge changes. There have been, though, a few gains. SNP taken East Lothian from Labour, SNP taken Ayr in the west of Scotland from the Conservatives, but that might not be quite as helpful as others actually, Ayr, because it might mean they get 1 less seat on the regional list. What they really wanted was 6 of the marginal constituencies of Scotland, the remaining ones they don't already have, to be confident of getting that magical overall majority of 65. So very significant was the result in Edinburgh Central here. This was Ruth Davidson's seat, of course, top target for the SNP, and Angus Robertson, former leader of the SNP in Westminster, and he won it, well, at a canter, as you can see there. Majority of 4,700, swing of 6.6%, net gain for the SNP. So far, so good. But then they also needed seats like Dumfriesshire, where they had had hopes, an example of where, however, there was clear unionist tactical voting. The Tories win it solidly, the SNP don't do enough, and you can see there is a clear transfer from Labour to the Conservatives, clearly in a unionist attempt to keep the SNP out. In Dumbarton, similar story, but there it was the other way, Tories keeping Labour in. And now as a result of this tactical unionist voting, it looks unlikely that the SNP can secure an overall majority. Much then attention will depend on what happens with the proportional list, the regional list, how far the Greens advance. This is how it was filled in last time. It seems very likely, as Kirsty was saying, that there will, as a result of Green advance on this list, be a clear pro-independence majority in the new Parliament, probably with the Greens, as I say, with the SNP. And we shouldn't forget there is virtually no doubt about how dominant the SNP is and that they have secured a 4th term of office. Indeed, we've seen tonight further proof that one party has come to dominate the politics of each of the nations of Great Britain. SNP hegemony in Scotland, Tory hegemony in England, partial Labour hegemony in Wales. There may have been, perhaps in these elections, a pandemic incumbency bonus this time. Either way, the internal politics of each of our constituent nations seems to pull yet further and further apart. Kirsty.
Thanks, Lewis. Well, the ramifications of today's results could have enormous consequences for Scotland and the United Kingdom. Here's our special correspondent, Alan Little.
Nicola Sturgeon will see a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament as an unambiguous mandate for a second independence referendum. Boris Johnson has said he will block it. If that happens, the UK government would be telling Scotland that it doesn't matter that you elected a pro-referendum majority, you can't have one. That, in effect, There is no democratic route to a second referendum. Is that sustainable? Constitutionally, yes, but politically, in the short term, it will be much easier for Boris Johnson if the SNP themselves fall short of an overall majority. But in the longer term, at what price? Historically, the Union has been strongest in periods when there has been a shared set of values and a common sense of purpose north and south of the border. This was true in the Age of Empire, during 2 world wars, and in the post-war construction of the welfare state. But since the 1980s, there has been a long, slow divergence in the values expressed at the ballot box. Historically, the Union weakens when Scotland has policies imposed on it that run counter to the prevailing public values of the day. This happened in the 1980s and 90s. That experience transformed the way Scotland thought about its place in the Union and led to the creation of the Scottish Parliament. It is happening again now, under a UK government closely aligned with the values of the Brexit heartlands. Support for independence is not based on identity alone. Increasingly, it is values-based. Many are motivated by the idea that independence is the route to a fairer, more equal society. And this is the question that any pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament now presents us with. Is there, or is there not, a democratic route to a second referendum? Or is Scotland, no matter who it votes for, simply forbidden from putting the independence question to the public again?
Alan Little. Well, I'm joined now by Kieran Martin, the former Constitution Director at the Cabinet Office under David Cameron. He helped to agree the framework for the 2014 independence referendum. Angus Robertson, the newly elected SNP MSP for Edinburgh Central, and Miles Briggs, the Chief Whip of the Scottish Conservatives, all with me now. Good evening to you all. Angus Robertson, is there a qualitative difference and whether you actually have an outright majority on the SNP or a majority for independence with other parties, including the Greens?
No, I don't think so. I think in any normal democracy, if there's a parliamentary majority for a policy, and if the parties that have been elected to that parliament have manifesto commitments which they seek to enact, then a majority is a majority is a majority. And we can dance on the head of a pin about whether there is a requirement, which there isn't, for the SNP to have an absolute majority in a PR parliament, which was designed to thwart a parliamentary majority. But I am confident that at the end of this Scottish Parliament election campaign, not only will the SNP have been re-elected for a 4th historic term on a manifesto commitment to have an independence referendum when we emerge from COVID, but that there will be a parliamentary majority involving SNP and Scottish Green Party members who will be in favour of an independence referendum. Now, either the UK is a democratic state that recognises the right of people in Scotland, if we vote for a parliament, to be able to give the green light to have a referendum, that should happen. Or by fiat, by rule of law, by imposition, democratic, perfectly legitimate wishes voted for by the public are going to be blocked. That is not at heart democratic values.
Well, let me turn to Miles Briggs now. You know, the Tories had one message. Your message was vote Tory, and indeed, if you vote Tory, you'll stop a referendum. The majority of voters in Scotland decided they didn't want to do that. And strangely, Boris Johnson is telling the Telegraph tomorrow that he had the impression the SNP had moved away from the idea of a referendum. Whatever gave him that idea, I'm not really very sure. But simply, the public didn't listen to you. They voted for pro-independence parties.
Well, Kirsty, we're halfway through the election results being declared, and already Nicola Sturgeon has reverted to type. It's quite clear that as we look towards the regional results being announced tomorrow, that the SNP are not going to do well, that we actually could see them lose the 4 regional seats they currently have. But I think it would be irresponsible at this point in time for us to be trying to drag the country back to another divisive referendum. And Nicola Sturgeon was saying that during the election.
Dragging the country back, or dragging the electorate back, the electorate who have actually voted for pro-independence parties, and it looks as if there will be a pro-independence majority, whatever happens tomorrow in the Scottish Parliament. That's just realistic.
Well, Nicola Sturgeon's been at pains throughout this campaign to say that this election was not about another referendum. It was about her record during the pandemic. And as your piece suggested, across the UK, we've seen political leaders potentially being rewarded for that. But Nicola Sturgeon was clear that this election wasn't about a referendum. And before half of the results are even declared, she's trying to say that's all she's after. I think people will be hugely disappointed with that.
Well, Ciaran Martin, I'd like to bring you in because, of course, you were one of the architects of the agreement that led to the 2014 referendum. Now, the point was, after the 2014 referendum, consent was given to the union. What might be different this time?
Well, I think the problem we faced is that an opportunity was missed after that referendum. There was a real absence of self-reflection that 9 out of 20 Scots had just voted to leave the United Kingdom, which in historic terms was extraordinary given what the position would have been 30 or 50 years previously. And I think the assumption seems to have been that the issue would go away rather than resurface, and there was this reliance on a slogan of once in a generation. But that was just that, a slogan. It's got the same constitutional standing as the £350 million for the NHS per week on a bus, and it doesn't invalidate the results of the election held yesterday. So I think, in a sense, it was a very difficult election constitutionally yesterday because it was an election dominated by the independence question, but there are no guidelines as to what happens now, and we're heading for a real constitutional dilemma with a conflict of mandate, if you like, as it does appear likely that there will be a pro-independence referendum, although as Mr. Briggs says there is no, there are no confirmed results yet. A conflict between mandate and law between Edinburgh and London, and that's a very difficult situation for the UK as a whole. And it goes to the heart of what the union is. Is it a union of consent or a union upheld by the force of law? And at the moment, we don't have an answer to that.
Well, from that point of view, Miles Briggs, what is your answer to that? Is it a union held by consent, or is it a union simply imposed by law? Actually, I think the phrase that Ciaran Martin used in an article recently was know your place unionism. Actually, no matter whether the overwhelming number of Scots want to have an independence referendum, it will be denied by Boris Johnson. Does he have the moral authority to do that?
Well, Scotland's the only part of the United Kingdom which has actually voted to renew our United Kingdom by saying in 2014 that we wanted to be part of the United Kingdom and vote to stay part. That was, as has been said, once in a lifetime, once in a generation, we were told.
We had the Brexit vote, and we've had further developments in the Scottish Parliament. We now have the possibility that we're going to have a majority SNP government. How do you think it will go down? It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And actually, what you're actually doing is trying to bind the union together simply by the rule of law rather than the consent of the people. That would be unprecedented. Well, actually, go back to 1707. Lots of the people did not consent to the union being established in 1707. It happened. But really, is that the way you want to run the party in Scotland? Is that the way you want to run the government in Scotland?
Well, if you look at opinion polls running up to this Holyrood election, we're seeing the numbers of people in Scotland supporting independence declining. We're seeing the number of people who actually want a referendum going backwards. And I think at this point in time, we've got to be honest. The next Parliament has so much to do around recovery. And I think people will judge all the new politicians to be elected to this Parliament very badly if the focus is purely going to be about the Constitution, not about protecting people's jobs, recovering our NHS and focusing on the things which this Parliament has the powers to actually transform people's lives around. If we're not going to do that, then I think in time even the SNP and the Greens will lose seats and lose support.
Well, Angus Robertson, just coming back to you, we know that Boris Johnson is planning to throw billions at Scots as his bid to build and save the union, a kind of a red wall effect. You know, more infrastructure programmes, much more spent here. Do you think that would have an impact on Scots who are trying to build back?
Can I just press pause here for a second? There's a massive elephant in the room which we have not even just talked about, which is the SNP are absolutely walking the Scottish Parliament elections. And we're being lectured to by a Conservative Party that has performed abysmally in comparison with the SNP, and incidentally, a political party that has not won a national election in Scotland since 1955. This is absolutely absurd. It cannot go on.
Are you living in a parallel universe? No, let me just put that to Miles Briggs. In a sense, of the Conservatives in Scotland living in a parallel universe, as Angus Robertson reminds us, you have to go back to 1955 Conservative majority in Scotland.
We're living in a period of time, and we also have a parliament which is proportionate, and we're seeing at this point in time that the SNP are unlikely to get a majority.
It is a proportionate parliament, but actually the strength of support for the SNP and the Greens has overridden that proportion. That's democracy.
Well, we'll see whether or not that is the result tomorrow. Like I say, we've still got half the results to declare. But actually, the politics of grievance and division, which we've seen Nicola Sturgeon push in this country for far too long, I think is what has undermined us for too long.
That seems to go down reasonably well. If you think it's a politics of grievance, it seems to be going down rather well with the electorate.
Well, sadly, if you go back to what I said originally, Nicola Sturgeon said this election wasn't about another independence referendum. She's changed her tune before even half the results are declared.
Kieran Martin, if I can just come back to you on... Could I just come back to you, Kieran Martin? Boris Johnson has repeated tonight they will do everything to oppose a referendum. Nicola Sturgeon says she's going to prepare legislation for a second referendum, and if necessary, this will go all the way to the Supreme Court. How could this play out?
I think it's a game of constitutional chess where both sides have very different pieces left on the board. The pro-independence movement will have a mandate. The Prime Minister and the government of the United Kingdom have the force of law. I would expect even if they lost a Supreme Court case, that the majority is there in the House of Commons to change the law to make sure any referendum cannot take place lawfully. And I would dismiss then so-called wildcat or illegal activity because it's not in the Scottish government or the Scottish independence movement's interest to do things like unilateral declarations of independence, because that would make the path to an independent Scottish state, its recognition by other countries, very, very difficult. So fundamentally, this is a clash of mandate and law where it will be decided by politics, and it goes to the absolute heart of the question. We have been told for many decades now that it's a voluntary union, but at the moment there is no lawful democratic path to the pursuit of Scottish independence. And that remains the case, and that really is the missing part of the constitutional jigsaw that the United Kingdom government has to answer at some point, because at the moment, whatever is said about how high up the priority list independence is in various polls, it was unmissable in this election, the independence referendum question, on both the SNP and the Green and indeed the Scottish Conservatives side. And in effect, the results of the conclusion of that election on that major leading issue is going to be set aside, is what we're hearing tonight.
Thank you all very much for joining us. Now back to you in London, Emily.
Thanks, Kirsty. Well, to reflect finally on what it all means, as if we would know that by now. We're joined by Alex Massey, Stephen Bush and Salma Shah. Nice to have you all. I wonder, Stephen, whether we should start with you. People are trying to work out what the dividing lines are this time round. Is it education, not class? That's something that The Spectator has raised. Is it a class divide that's got more subtle? Do you understand the voting tribes?
I don't think anyone does, to be honest. I think the trouble is, if it is education, not class, we do have to explain a little bit why a non-graduate in Wales is happy to vote for the Labour Party and a non-graduate in a city in England is happy to vote for the Labour Party, but you get out into the English towns and countryside and they're not. So I think the new divides are about place. I think actually a lot of them are about this weird world of ultra-low interest rates we're in. If you think about somewhere like Hartlepool, yes, you have huge deprivation in terms of services, but you have a lot of owner-occupiers who, they don't have very much disposable income, but they are asset-rich because of the weird world of post-crisis interest rates. Yeah. So I think it's a whole bunch of things.
Let me pick up with you, Alex, and the question that Kirsty left us with, that quote from Nicola Sturgeon, which is that she would go ahead with legislation for a referendum and Boris would have to go to the Supreme Court. How should Boris Johnson deal with Nicola Sturgeon?
Well, I mean, the difficulty for Boris Johnson is that there is no happy way for him to deal with Nicola Sturgeon. The risk that he takes is that denying a referendum to the SNP, to Scotland, risks persuading people in Scotland who do not presently want a referendum that actually they do. And that is, if you like, something that the SNP are trusting will take place. And so it is a long-term struggle, if you like, for supremacy in in Scotland between the forces of unionism and the forces of nationalism. The country is effectively divided 50-50 on this question. And the best Boris Johnson can really do, I suspect, is to manage the situation, to keep it simmering, but not allow it to boil over, and then hope that his successor has better fortune than he does. But any direct interventions from the Prime Minister himself are likely to be unhelpful to the cause he ostensibly represents.
Right, so pushing it down the line. Salma, I wonder what that means in terms of the things that will be thrown at the government, I guess, in terms of a democratic mandate, if they think that they are pushing against democracy.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because given Boris Johnson's election results, I mean, we might be looking at an early election in 2023, so he might be pushing it down the line for quite a long time if he comes back as a second-term Prime Minister. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to argue against the democratic mandate, but there is kind of a small sort of silver lining as far as unionists are concerned, because whilst the Scottish Conservative Party haven't made the gains that they might have hoped for, the Scottish Labour Party has done slightly better. And actually the case for unionism versus, you know, the political party differences, it might show that actually a resurgence in Labour could actually help Westminster Conservative and a Conservative government actually make the argument to say that let's wait and see, you know, how this is actually going to pan out before we go down that route again.
Stephen, more broadly on Labour, the language that they've used has been slightly apocalyptic. It's been, you know, shattering and terrible and disappointing. And yet when you get the projected national share, which we know is a sort of, you know, it's a psephologist's invention, but it projects what a sort of, you know, the poll of an election would look like. The Conservatives are on 36% and the Labours are on a fairly credible 29%, with the Lib Dems sort of, you know, coming to third place on 18%. So, I mean, are things, you know, are things as bad for Labour as they look tonight?
No, but I think, look, this is a depressing truth, but it is easier for the Labour Party to go, oh, we're awful, we're terrible, yeah, and go around beating their breasts, than it is for them to go, maybe the vaccine rollout's been handled well. And that is part of the grim internal politics of all political parties. It's much easier to beat yourself up than it is to put your hands up and give the other lot some credit.
And what would you be advising them to do then, now?
I think they should avoid having a prolonged public fight. I think their big problem over the last year has been lack of discipline. Yeah, they have this weird situation where they have announced more policies than any opposition party in their first year than I have covered, and yet they have. And yet people do not know what they stand for. I suspect because they've announced quite so many policies, they should thin down a few themes. Just that one of the things David Cameron did very well is basically everything he did in his first year was, I don't like climate change. I do like gay people, and I'm not opposed to ethnic minorities who earn a bit of money on the side. And that was the heart of that first successful rebrand of the Conservatives after years of losing under Tony Blair, just to have a few simple themes. Labour's had far too much complexity under last year. I think they really just need to have simple, clear themes about what they stand for.
And Alex, do you think in terms of Boris Johnson now, I mean, the more popular or the more electorally successful he becomes in England, do you think that does create a harder question for the union, or does it give him the strength to power through?
Undoubtedly it does. I mean, if you look at the political map of the United Kingdom now, you see the SNP utterly dominant in Scotland, Labour extremely strong in Wales, and the Conservatives really taking a very, very, very firm grip on England. And the Tory grip on England and the Tory party's Englishness is something that contributes to the SNP's success in Scotland and, I believe, to Labour's success in Wales. And the more England asserts itself within the union, the more it places the union under strain, because England counts for 85% of it. So you have the old line about, used about Canada, that Trudeau used about Canada and the United States, that, Canada's situation was akin to being in bed with an elephant. Now that's all very fine, so long as the elephant remembers to behave himself. But if the elephant starts misbehaving or thrashing around in the bed, then life becomes very uncomfortable for everyone else. And that is the situation that we are clearly in right now.
Salma, I want to end as we began, which was this question about the status quo. It's very odd to be in the middle of a parliament and to find people voting for the parties that are in power, broadly in the different nations. Is that sustainable? Is it a complete one-off?
I think it's absolutely incredible. And certainly for the Conservative Party, having been in power for 11 years and managing to somehow evolve and appear different, I think is very, very interesting indeed. I do think that there is an underlying shift that's happening where, as you say, the status quo is changing. And I think that's economic, and you touched on this before, is that the two main parties, Labour and Conservative, seem to be borrowing each other's clothes, particularly economically. So I think we are going to have to see when the next general election comes round, where people's intellectual, ideological positions have settled, because I think that is really going to be the battle.
Thank you all very much indeed. Really good of you to join us tonight. And that is all from us for tonight. Kirsty will be back tomorrow from Edinburgh with all the results across the weekend. That's on BBC One, and she's starting at 1:15. And we'll both be back here on Monday with the last of the results. Till then, thanks for joining us and good night.